All right, so today we're wanted to talk about heliodons and sun studies, and I don't think he's here today, but I just wanted to thank Jeff Willett for working tirelessly to build this model. Actually, I think it might be a SketchUp import. I'm not sure. Anyway, so long ago, like, I don't know, 5, 6 versions ago, there was a sun object in Vectorworks, but it was essentially just a directional light, and you would calculate the azimuth and orientation for you, and so forth. And there were all sorts of workarounds in order to be able to do multiple times of day and days of the year for sun studies. And for quite a while now, we've had the Heliodon tool, and it's a pretty cool little tool, and has a couple of little nuances that I thought were worth looking at. So I have here obviously a Vectorworks file. I'm rendering it in OpenGL, and all of my renderings are going to be in OpenGL today, I think. Maybe not. And the first thing that I want to do is I want to place a Heliodon in my file. Now, there already is one. One of the things that you may encounter as you delve into sun studies is that you might have multiple Heliodons in your file eventually. So one of the first things that I do, if it isn't already baked into a template, is that I create a little script to select the Heliodon. I might have multiple layers on my file, and it's just kind of a useful thing to do. So I'm going to start off with that. Under Tool, I'm going to do a custom selection, select only, and in this case, I'll create a Python script. And so the criteria will be, type is Heliodon, there it is. And so in custom selection, it only shows you the objects that are in the file as options to custom select. So we know there's already a Heliodon here. And I can choose Heliodons that are within symbols and so forth. But in this case, there's only one, and that's okay. I'll go ahead. I've already created a script palette called script, so I'll put it in that palette, and I'll name this thing select Heliodon. There we go. And you can see that it shows up right here in my script palette. And so if I double click on that, you could see that it now shows up in the shape pane of my object info palette, which is already open. So it doesn't really matter what the X and the Y and the Z are of your Heliodon. It does matter, of course, what layer you place your Heliodon on, since if the layer is turned off, you won't be able to see the effects of the Heliodon. So in this case, if I go to a top plan view, right, there's the Heliodon. Here's my model of Ronchamp, and actually this this light monitor here over here faces north, so that Heliodon has already been placed accurately north. And Basel is the closest major city that shows up in the Heliodon database for you to pick, and so it'll be pretty close, right? But if I want to get really accurate, I can, under location, I can choose the region. In this case, Ronchamp is close to Switzerland, but it's actually in France. And it's very close, just a short drive from a city called Belfort, which how about that, is not on the list. Not a problem. I can just click on Edit City. I'll give it a unique name. And a little internet search tells me that the latitude and longitude of Belfort are about 48 north and about 7 degrees east. It's in the GMT +1 time zone, and then I'll just click Add. And I've already done this, so there it is, right here. There's Belfort, so I've created it, I've added it to my database, and now the orientation is and location are more accurate. So now that I've got my Heliodon, you'll notice that I have soft shadows and a physical sun and physical sky shown. That just gives me slightly more accurate renderings if I'm using RenderWorks, but as today I'm just doing OpenGL. That's really not that relevant. Now, in my OpenGL settings, you can see that under my rendering settings, under OpenGL options, I've chosen very high detail because there's a bit of curvature to this model, and I'm showing textures and colors and giving a pixel thickness. 3 is a little thick, but 2 might be okay. And it's important to use shadows, and I would go ahead and go with at least high, perhaps medium quality if your model was extremely intense. If you don't do that, if you deselect shadows, then you'll get the shading effect of the Heliodon. Whoops. You'll get the shading effect of the Heliodon, but you won't get the shadows, making the tool of very, very limited usefulness. So another option that I have in my RenderWorks options, and again, I'm using RenderWorks here because it's fast and it's real time, and that's of interest to me. One option that I have is I can turn off textures and colors, and I might do that for a very texture intense model. We're doing a lot of sun studies, would just add to the rendering time. Or if I sort of deliberately wanted kind of a foam core or museum board kind of effect, where I'm really focusing on the geometry, the light, the shade, and the shadow, and I don't want to get too distracted by colors and textures. So I've given myself a save view here where I've turn those colors off. So when I have my Heliodon selected, you'll notice that I have a solar animation button here at the bottom. So I've got a couple of options, several options actually. One is that I can animate the sun. In other words, the building stays fixed, and as I'm moving the slider around to different months of the year or days of the year for a given time, in this case 2 p.m., right? Those shadows are animated, or I can pick different times of day for a given date. And for any day that I pick, let's say 11th of March, right, today, and right, it'll give me a sunrise and a sunset for that latitude and longitude. So I can look and see what the sunrise conditions are like, sunset, any time in between. So this kind of real-time animation or testing is pretty useful. And oftentimes I may want to fine-tune that to a very specific time, so I can choose larger or smaller increments of time. So I can give myself 5-minute increments. See what happens there. 5-minute increments, or the default is 15. So that's one option. The other thing that I can animate is I can animate the view. So in this case, as I let me back out of here a little bit. So this is what I'm going to do is I'm going to move, as counterintuitive as this is, I'm going to move the Heliodon to the center of the model. Let's go to solar animation and animate the view to the Heliodon center and get a little closer. Heliodon center. Nope, too far perhaps. Bit of a trial and error there. Let's go to a front view, yeah. It should be okay. Well, that's a little better. So once again, there's the Heliodon center. Not really. Okay, you can kind of see it there, pretty small on my screen. So now, as I'm animating through different times of the day, right? I'm riding on Helios's chariot. Maybe I could go to a larger time increment, 30 minutes. Don't need to go to 15-minute increments. So I'm riding on Helios's chariot, as it were, and this is what the sun sees. So one thing you'll notice, obviously, is that there are no shadows in this view because, of course, the sun never sees a shadow. And so I can see what the sun is going to see, as it were, on its path throughout the day. Or I could look at more or less noon, right? And look at that, different months of the year. As you'd expect, summertime, sun's high overhead. Wintertime, oh, there you go. Sun's lower. So that's another option. Let's see what happens. Nah, I don't want to do that. It's frankly not a rendering mode or a view mode that I use a lot for Heliodon studies, but it is useful because anything that you can see from this view is not going to be shaded at that particular moment in time. And so if you're trying to evaluate, an elevation of fenestration, and you want to see, well, how many of my windows are going to be in the sun? Well, if you see them using this solar animation view to the Heliodon center or the layer plane center, whatever, if you see it, it's in the sun, right? So these windows down here are going to be subject to direct solar insolation. The disadvantage of this kind of solar animation, where I'm just taking a static view of the building and I'm looking at it throughout the year or throughout the day, is that for some buildings, I might need to pick two different vantage points, maybe a southeast and a southwest corner. It just depends on what's available, in order to be able to kind of get the whole picture, as it were. So another option for a solar animation is, instead of doing this interactive sort of real-time slider base, right, is I can pick a particular date, a day of the year, and I can go ahead and export a movie of what the sun is doing on that given day. So in this case, I'll choose an increment of 15 minutes. That's just fine. And I can show time of day and show the month of the date as a floating piece of text. Now, in order for that to work, to see the time of day and the month and day, I need to be sure that in my unified view that screen objects are visible, right? Because the text that is generated in order to display time elapsing, that text is a 2D object. And so if I disable screen objects, then I won't be able to see that text. So you want to make sure that this is selected if you want to display your sun path. So let's go ahead and look and see what the sun is going to be, the solar animation is going to be like today at Ronchamp. And I'll export a movie, 15-minute increments is just fine. I'll hit OK. And then I'll get an option to click the time and date. So I'll hit OK. And I'll just click somewhere here, say the upper left corner. And here I can choose frames per second and the quality and the frame size. So I find 15 is a little too stuttery. 24 is generally about good. And one of the nice things about OpenGL is that it's a very fast rendering mode. So going to high doesn't really have much of a computational penalty. It's not going to take you that much longer to render at high, and you'll get much better quality than medium. On the other hand, very high for OpenGL is sometimes you can't really tell the difference. So I can choose a standard 720 or 1080p size, or any of these other standard size, or I can choose a custom size. I find the standard 1920 by 1080 is usually just fine. I'll hit OK. It'll ask me where I want to save this, and it'll automatically give me the name of the Heliodon, in this case, the town of Belfort, and the date. And so it'll create a QuickTime movie, and it's going to give me a little preview here. You can see my text is kind of huge, sort of in the way. But that's only about 48 frames, and it's just chugging through them pretty quickly. So, maybe I want my text to be smaller, or maybe I don't want to give it a fill. I can fine tune all of these things, obviously. But while that's kind of doing its thing, let me check the chat channel and see. Why would you use the sun view, says Bill? Well, I don't know if I've answered that, but you would use the sun view because it's an intuitive way to see what the sun sees. In other words, if I see it, I can tell that it's going to be in sun, and if I can't see it, then I know the sun can't see it. It's the digital analogy of I remember in architecture school, one of my professors would have us hold our model out at arm's length and sort of rotate it around, and ask us to see what the sun sees. So there you go. So there you go. I've made a movie. I'm going to go ahead and hide this, and I'm not sharing that, but I will in just a second. So let me do a new share. There we go. Can everybody see that? So you can see that is really very fast, right? So you might want to slow it down. You might want to change your increments. If you're doing a QuickTime player, one of your options, I forget where it is to loop. There you go. So now you can hit a loop, and you get this nice sort of digital wallpaper. And you can use the scrubber and sort of slide it around so that's a little bit smoother and sort of help you evaluate your shadows and so forth. So if I were to do this again, a couple of things I might do is set my attribute fill to none. I'll go ahead and select my Heliodon again, do a solar animation, export a movie. 18 points is pretty big. Maybe 18 and 9 is good enough. And I'll click OK and put that in here. Frames per second, quality high. Oh, let me cancel that. I'm sorry, I forgot one important step. Export interval. One of the things that it doesn't do is remember your settings. So maybe I'll do 10-minute intervals or 5-minute intervals. That'll take a lot longer to export, obviously. Place it. So it's going to be a bit longer. So again, I might pick a couple of different, say, views and pick opposite corners so that I can see what's going on through most of my building that is being exposed to direct sunlight from 2 or 3 different vantage points. Now, the question often comes up, like, if I'm creating an animation, and again, the interactive slider, that's really useful for me in real time as I'm designing. But for example, if I want to show a client or a colleague or somebody, some of the ramifications of different roof overhangs or window placements or whatnot, having a movie file that I can share, that's pretty easy for anybody to digest and grab the slider and move it around and sort of evaluate what it is that you're trying to accomplish. But given that I can only do an animation for a particular day of the year, the question arises, what days of the year should I do these solar animations for? So the obvious 3 are the summer solstice, the winter solstice, and then one of the equinoxes. It doesn't matter which equinox because the sun path is identical, right? And that is certainly useful. But I think probably one of the most useful times to do a solar animation is when your climate is changing, when you're in your region, when the time of year when you transfer from heating degree days to cooling degree days, or from cooling degree days to heating degree days. In other words, at what time of the year does it start to get warm enough that I'm going to want to turn on the AC, or at what time of the year is it going to start to get cold enough that I'm going to want to turn on the heat? And the AC question is obviously important because the more solar shading I can provide, then the further I can delay or reduce that energy load from cooling. Likewise, if I design my overhangs properly, then I can get lots of good deep winter light, and I can get a little bit of passive heating. So that transition time and you can look these up. There's average meteorological data files for numerous hundreds of locations throughout the world, and so you can look up when those transition zones are for you. So, for example, in Austin, one of those key transition points is around October 20th. And if you think about it, there are even late in October in Austin, we can have some rather warm days, but at the same time, the sun is starting to get fairly low in the horizon because it's starting to transition to a winter sun path. And as a result, let's do a new share. I've got to close that, hide, gotta open this. All right, there we go. So here's my second iteration of the movie. You can see that the date and time are a little bit smaller and out of the way, and it's a little bit slower paced. So, so as I was saying, around October 20th, the sun path is actually starting to get fairly low. So roof overhangs are a little less useful than they are in, say, June or July. So that's actually a really challenging time of year to design for, because you're getting some solar gain, which is desirable for winter conditions. You've got a sort of a wintry sun path. Only the problem is that it might be 80, 85 degrees. So it's actually, I sometimes almost don't even bother with doing sun studies for June, simply because the sun is so high that a little bit of roof overhang goes a really long way. That's not the worst case scenario to design for if you're trying to provide significant passive shading. All right, let's go back to the lines. So would exporting the solar animations take longer if you include textures? Yeah, it might take a little bit longer. It really depends on how intense your textures are. My primary reason for doing textureless or colorless solar animations is to kind of stay focused on the design task at hand and not get sort of distracted by color. If everything is sort of a uniform color, then you've got a much clearer intuitive grasp of what's a shadow, what's shading, and what's just a dark material. So and of course I can do these solar animations. I might pick another point, say over here, zoom in, do a nice save, move in. Whoa, a little too fast there. All right, I might pick that. Save that view. That's what, southwest. Right, and so having these save views is really, really handy. So there may be times when I may not be able to produce an animation, or I can produce an animation, but perhaps I have to share something static. So for example, I might want to show, I don't know, 3 or 4 or a half dozen sun studies on a drawing set as a cover sheet for a project where shading is really important. And so being able to have these sort of static renderings and a series of static renderings is actually quite useful in some cases. So let me go back to, sure, that's a good view. I've got this view set up, and so now I'll just go and create a viewport. And I'll create a new sheet layer. It doesn't matter what it's called. And I'll call this March Southwest. That's fine. Notice that it's going to give me the same sort of view options that I have currently selected as a default. So here I am on my sheet. I'll go ahead and play with my page setup here. Maybe do for any printer, say do an ArcD. Right, so there's my viewport on an ArcD. And let's go ahead and crop it. And I'll go ahead and update it. All right, so there's what March looks like in that view. There we go. And maybe I want to see what's June like. Having just said that June is not a super useful, at least. So now I want June. Well, I'm kind of stuck because I've got this Heliodon for March, and if I change that Heliodon from March to June, then that's going to mess up my March rendering. So another important thing to keep track of is your visualization palette. You can find it under Tools. I'm sorry, Window, Palettes, Visualization. And if you don't want to bother with this little script here that I made for us, and you click on that, you can see that any light objects that are visible in that viewport, I can either select all light objects everywhere or just the ones that are in the selected viewport. In this case, it's the same thing. There's only one light object. There's only one Heliodon. So I can also navigate by just right-clicking on that, and I can force select. So if I do that, it will immediately kick me over. So it's kind of like that script that I made for you. I'm going to go back to Plan View. I'm going to move this guy over here. I really don't know why it's that humongous, but anyway, it is what it is. So I'm just going to duplicate that Heliodon, just do an Option drag. And I'm going to change it from March to June. And, you know, let's go for the solstice. And so you can see now that in my visualization palette, right, both March and June, it automatically renames the Heliodon with the date. So let's go back to that sheet layer. And if I click on the viewport, all of the visible light sources are, as I said, listed here in the visualization palette. So for this one, I can just turn June off. I'll just uncheck that checkbox. And for now, I'll select the other viewport and I'll deselect March. And while I'm at it, I'll rename this June. And then I'll update it. And I'll update this one. So let me hide my palette. So there you go. You've got March and you've got June. Now these look really grainy because my my sheet layer is set to 72 DPI. Right? I can crank that up to 300. I don't recommend it. I'm going to go to 144. So if all you have is line drawings, like technical drawings, your CDs or whatnot, the DPI of the sheet layer makes no difference whatsoever because vectors are vectors. But if you have a raster rendering like this, your sheet layer DPI is going to matter. And obviously, if you double the DPI because you're talking about surface area, width times height, you're going to quadruple the number of pixels, hence quadruple the rendering time. Now, this relatively small model like this with, sure, there's a lot of curvature, but there's, it's not that crazy. The rendering times are negligible. But, if you had a really intricate model with lots of facets going on and you dial that puppy up to 600 DPI, you could be spending a lot of time, making and drinking coffee, waiting for your renderings to render. Speaking of coffee, and of course, this is OpenGL, which is a very low intensity rendering mode. So if you've got like a continuous rendering like this, then it's just fine to go to maybe about 200 DPI. You probably won't see a huge difference in terms of quality between 200 and 300 DPI. Now, if you have something like text, or you'll get some pixelation, and that will be noticeable for line work. But for continuous shaded surfaces, because of the way ink spreads, there's not a huge difference between 200 and 300 DPI, but there's a lot more rendering time for 300. So I generally cut it off at about 200 unless I'm doing art for a book or something that's going to be, a high quality print. All right, so cool. So we've got March, we've got June. Hey, let's go ahead and let's do this again. And we'll do December. Even try to spell it right. Go back to my visualization, force select June, drag June over here, change that to December. Right. Go back to my sheet layer. Okay, and having just created December, I'm going to have to deselect it from these two. So this one has March, this one has June. You can see in this one, I just want to have December. So because I can control the visualization of the activation of, of my Heliodon through the visualization palette, I don't need to create, like I've seen people create like separate layers, one layer for every Heliodon or sun object, or a class for winter sun and summer sun and afternoon sun, and you don't need to do all that. So long as you use your visualization palette, you can just turn them off and on if they're relevant. So there we go. We've got these three viewports, right? And I can see the relative difference between March, June, and December for essentially the same time of day. And so a whole series of these might actually be, kind of informative. Let me go back and see if there's no questions just yet. All right, great. Do chime in, and if you've got other questions. So those, yeah.
So now that you have three Heliodons in your model space, is that right?
Yep, I sure do.
If you're looking at the model, are you going to see three shadow lines?
Yeah, I sure am. And okay. But my visualization palette is going to come to the rescue. There's December. There's June.
Okay.
Yeah, so the visualization palette is not just, great question, Don. The visualization palette is not just useful for sheet layer viewports. It's actually perfectly helpful for your design layers as well.
Okay, thanks.
It is your buddy. And, you know, I mean, you can put your heliodons in their own classes and all that. I mean, you know, by all means, help yourself. But the visualization palette makes it super easy just to control heliodons. Incidentally, this also works for any kind of light source. So, you know, let's say that you kind of wake up one morning as a bit of an overachiever, and you put a light source in every one of your recessed cans that you populate your model with, and then you do a rendering, and you're wondering, why is my model taking so long to render? And you know, why are there so many shadows everywhere? Looks like a cheap Hollywood set. And that's because, you know, you've got all these light sources. So if you had a symbol with a light source in it, that symbol would show up in the visualization palette with as many instances of that light source. And if you turned it off in one, you would turn it off in all of them. But so you can control all of your lights from the visualization palette. It's super, super useful and indispensable, really.
Francois, question.
Yeah.
There used to be limitations on the number of light objects you could have on at one time, but that doesn't seem to be true anymore. Am I getting that right?
I'm not aware of any limitations on the number of light objects that Vectorworks will let you have. I would assume that you just may decide that after, you know, a dozen or so light sources, that you've got better things to do with your life than watching Vectorworks render. Rendering with light is a whole another ball of wax, because if you really try to be super accurate with your lighting, you know, again, like let's say you build a symbol for every light and you put a light source in every symbol, you know, you could easily have 60, 70 lights just in a residence, right? And you want to turn all of those on thinking, well, I'm going to have a really accurate representation of what the lighting's going to be like. If your goal is to do some sort of a photometric study, okay, I guess. But if your goal is to just have a really nice rendering, you don't necessarily, you can have it look like there's a bunch of light in the space without having, you know, 60 individual lights. So I don't want to get too far off the beaten path, but I know one thing I've mentioned before, and something that I do is trick that I learned from Dan Jansenson, is to apply a glow shader to your ceilings. And that sort of simulates the reflected light that white ceilings necessarily have, and avoids their looking kind of like these kind of zombie gray dead ceilings. So there are tricks to rendering that the idea is that with rendering, you're not necessarily looking for truth, you're looking for verisimilitude, which is not at all the same thing.
Is it too much off topic to show us how to do a glow shader?
Kind of, but I mean, if we have time, remind me and I'll loop back to it.
Okay.
Yeah, we can look at that at the end. Yeah, I mean, if we could have a year of Vectorworks meetings just about rendering. All right, so I think we'll have time. Gail, just remind me so I don't forget, because you know, as you know, I will. All right, so super useful to have my visualization over here with all of these lights. And I think this is my update button. So that's June, I need to turn that on. December, I need to turn that on. Okay, cool. So there's a couple of other things about the Heliodon tool which actually don't have very much to do with rendering per se. let me go to my, say, view here. And I'll go to top. And let me render that. And in fact, let's just do a little perspective. There you go. That's cute. All right. So I'll just draw a rectangle here and create a viewport. Interesting. Go back to my design layer. Okay, there we go. Okay, so one of the things about heliodons is if I pop a north arrow, where are you? Come on. There you go. So pop a north arrow. With your north arrow, notice that there's a use heliodon button here. And if you have multiple heliodons and you select, it'll allow you to select which heliodon you want to use. Now, they're all have the same orientation, so it doesn't really matter. So, so your north arrow can be responsive to your heliodon, which is nice because it, I guess it's, I went over it very, very quickly, but right, I did mention that all of these heliodons are rotated 90 degrees because of the orientation of the model. And so, you know, obviously, if I rotated my model so that north was at the top of the screen, then I would want to rotate my heliodons so that everything is correctly oriented, right? So just be aware that that if if once you get your heliodon locked in so that it is facing the correct, it's oriented correctly with respect to north, the north arrows on all of your plans can also pick up on that, and you don't have to like manually reset, the north orientation of all of your heliodons, which is kind of cool. The one downside to that that you might want to be aware of is that if you I don't think this is really at quarter inch scale. I think this thing is out of scale, but that's okay. We'll live. The thing to be aware of is that if I copy a north arrow that's linked to a heliodon and I paste it into a file that doesn't have a heliodon, it's kind of locked into the last orientation that it has, and I won't be able to unlock it or rotate it until I give it a heliodon in the same file to latch onto. So just be aware of that if you're copying and pasting your north arrows from file to file, and you're using that heliodon link feature, you want to be sure that in the target file there's also a heliodon, or your north arrow will be stuck. I think I've covered all of the bases, or at least everything I wanted to hit with my notes. So if there are other questions before I go back to Gail's glow texture. you're
How-
talking, you'll have to unmute yourself. Yep.
Your second animation, how big was the file?
Oh, how big are those files? Let's see,
The larger one.
17.5 megabytes.
Thank you.
Yep. And that's, yeah. There, yeah, I think sometimes they will get up to, sometimes they'll get up to, I've had them go to, 50 megs, something like that, if they're really, there's a whole lot going on, but they're not huge files by today's standards. Could easily throw that at somebody's phone and it wouldn't blink. Any other questions? Okie dokie.
Oh,
Glow textures.
I don't know what that is.
All right, so here we are inside. That's a wide perspective. Oh, I need to share my screen, don't I? All right, this is a pretty lo-fi model. You know what? I'm gonna start a new file for this. Just be easier. All right. What's in the box? All right. Wide perspective. All right, so here we go. So there's no light source here. I'll go ahead and add a light source in a second. Let me just save this view. Okay, go top plan. I'll throw in a Heliodon because, that's what we're up to today. And Austin. Okay. And let's go back to my interior view. And okay. So there's my view, and this is all pretty lifeless. Everything's gray. So so I want to go ahead and give that ceiling some life. So like one thing I could do is I could have a bunch of lights shining up at it, but then they wouldn't be very even, and just kind of it. I'll do my best, but I end up with something that doesn't actually look very credible. So I'm going to go to my resource manager and in this untitled view, and let's go to RenderWorks texture, sorry, wrong tab. And I'll right click and create a new RenderWorks texture. I'll call it ceiling glow. I kind of like that spelling of ceiling. So color can be object attributes, and under reflectivity, I'm just going to choose glow. And I probably don't want 100%. I'll start with 50%. And then I will click on this floor, and under the object info palette, under render, under bottom, I will give it a texture, this ceiling glow texture. Now this is OpenGL, so I don't think I'm going to get any love from this. But if I go to, say, custom RenderWorks, I'll just even do a realistic. We'll see how long that takes. Why is it re-rendering?
Francois, did you create a floor in that model?
Yeah. For the floor?
Yeah.
No. The ceiling is a floor object.
But I'm talking about the floor itself. It looked like it was a green background, which made me think there was no floor, just the ground. Or
There
is
is
it?
no floor.
It's on the ground. Okay, I get it.
No, there's just nothing. It's just open. All right, so that's not really working for me. So let's go ahead and edit that. I can add matte reflectivity, and let's dial up the brightness to 85. And I'm going to cancel this rendering and just go to OpenGL. Okay. And I'm gonna actually do a custom RenderWorks. So shadows, textures, colors. Let's do all high, one reflection. Environment lighting will be medium. Lighting objects, do normal 4 bounces. Off. Let's do a HDRI white. I'm just guessing on these guys. Could be off. Soft shadows, medium. Okay. I'm going to cancel that because it's just getting blown out by the HDRI. So I'm going to go back to my resource manager and go to RenderWorks backgrounds. Here's my HDRI white. Oh, let's use physical sky interior. We'll see what that does. Let's go back to view, custom RenderWorks. This is what happens when we go off script. It's a lot of trial and error.
My fault.
No, it's fine. This is how we learn, right?
Yes, for sure.
I do not know why it's not re-rendering. There we go.
It's always lovely to watch someone else's trial and error.
Yeah, this is why we save templates and so forth. So yeah, this is still way, way, way too bright. So I'm gonna take that HDRI white and duplicate it and give myself a 50% and then edit that and change the brightness to 50%. And then for cut some kind of loop here. And then for custom RenderWorks, oh, yeah, that's better. There we go. Still pretty bright, but you can see, right, that that ceiling is obviously better lit than the walls.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's in spite of the fact that, you know, the sun is overhead, so it should be in shadow. So I can demonstrate this by going back to my RenderWorks textures and editing the ceiling glow and dialing it down from 85 to 50, for example. And then that'll cause it to re-render. Now it's closer to the walls, but it's still distinctly brighter, which is, you know, if you remember your zonal cavity lighting calculations, right? You would assign, you know, a certain percentage of your reflectance to your ceiling, a certain to your wall, a very low reflectance. You would weight the ceiling and the walls differently from the floor, right, in the zonal cavity method. And so if I give that no texture and then I re-render it, this is what it looks like without a glow texture. It's kind of gray everywhere, right? Looks like a Walmart. And that's, you know, that's far preferable than putting, you know, 6 or 10 lights and shining them up at the ceiling.
Thank you for doing that.
Sure. And again, you just kind of, it is, I mean, that's the thing about rendering is it's a lot of trial and error.
Yeah.
And sort of seeing, yeah, that looks good. No, that doesn't look good. That worked fine the last time I tried it, but I still have to tweak it this time because, you know, there are more windows in this project or fewer, or, you know, whatever.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Oh, looks like there's another chat question. Oh, that's Bill's question about there's a floor. No, Bill, you're just seeing the blue and the green of the, if I go to an OpenGL rendering here, you know, when you do an OpenGL rendering, you just get under your interactive settings, this kind of blue-green horizon line.
Right, that's why I was asking if there was no floor, because it just looks at the ground, but the ground will work too, so.
Yeah. Well, there's no ground, it's just a blue-green horizon line, the vector. Like if I exported this as
Green
an
reflects.
animation, it would just not, it would.
But if
not
that
show
had
up.
a floor, then that would affect the lighting bounces and things like that, wouldn't it?
Yeah, if I do something like 16 bounces, but you can see that in my custom RenderWorks, I've limited my bounces to 1
Oh, right.
because I just don't want to go crazy.
But there's nothing to, if the light's coming from above, there's nothing to bounce off of if there's no floor.
Yes, that's right.
Yep.
Again, there's kind of two categories of renderings, right? One is as an analysis tool, do I, you know, what it tried to predict what the interior lighting is going to be like given what I know or decide about the project versus I want a good looking rendering. And those are two completely different objectives. So. Well, everybody, any other questions about glow shaders or heliodons or sun studies?
I guess
All
one,
right.
has there been, it doesn't look like there's a huge amount of development in the Heliodon in, you know, in the latest versions. It's got a few more adjustments, but generally it's the same concept that we've been using for years, right?
Yeah, I don't know that there were really, the latest development that I'm aware of with the Heliodon is linking the north arrow to the Heliodon and vice versa, or that. And also for geo-referencing, if you're going to geo-reference, you can have your Heliodon be geo-referenced as well. And that is an entire different topic, which I'm contemplating bringing up at a later time, except I don't know enough about it, so I got to learn.
I vote for that, the geo-referencing.
Yeah.
Please, yes.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank
All right.
you.
Well, thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Francois.
All right. Bye-bye.
Everybody.
Thank
Be well,
you.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye, Becky.
Thanks, Francois.
Oh, you're very welcome. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
What is?
Bye, Guy.